So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Winnie Dunn. She is going to be talking to us today about supporting autistic children and specifically about practical strategies for emotion and sensory regulation. Again, as a pediatrician, I can tell you that one of the toughest things for me to watch or for me to think about with families is how do I help this kiddo build skills so that they can experience their environment in a way that is acceptable to them, meaningful to them. And so this presentation is going to explore practical, evidence-informed strategies to support emotion and sensory regulation in autistic children. You're going to gain a deeper understanding of sensory processing differences, emotional regulation experiences commonly seen in autistic children and autistic individuals. And we'll also highlight tools and techniques that can be applied across clinical, educational, and home settings to promote self regulation, reduce distress, and foster meaningful engagement. We will obviously be also honoring each child's unique strengths and needs. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Winnie Dunn. For the next 45 minutes, she's going to be talking to us about supporting autistic children, practical strategies for emotion and sensory regulation. Over to you, Winnie.
Thanks, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen here um, so we can. There we go. As Kristen said, it's really important that we have visual and auditory things. So I have a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about on the screen for you. And there are some handouts as supporting material, not handouts that you have to do while I'm talking, but for you to think about later on. So I'm a distinguished professor in the College of Health Sciences in the Department of Occupational Therapy at the University of Missouri. Um, Today, we're going to talk about the link between emotional regulation and sensory processing. Sometimes when we see children's behaviors and they're intense, we want to deal with the behaviors right in front of us, when sometimes there are things that are sort of running in the background that help us to foster emotional regulation so that children and adults can function properly and effectively and in a satisfying way with each other. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing I want you to know is that every single human being has sensory patterns. Every single person, not just people with ADHD or the autistic community or people with schizophrenia. Every single person. This is part of our humanity. And so, because that's true, we can all understand some of the things that maybe seemed baffling to us before. So we're going to look at this in a little more detail this morning. So the first thing, to give ourselves a scaffolding, we're going to look at a model called Dunn's sensory processing framework. This model was created from data from about 1,100 families. And it's important to say that because anybody can make a model or a conceptual framework to uh, show their ideas about something. But I want you to understand that this particular model, I wasn't smart enough to figure it out without feedback and data from families. And it took me a long time to understand all the parts. So even though today it seems easier to talk about, it came from what the families told us originally. So this model is based on two really important constructs. The first one is called neurological thresholds. This is from neuroscience, and it is a continuum from high to low. And at the you can see the vertical arrow there. The high threshold means that the neurons and the brain need a lot of information in order to notice and then fire or act on the information. On the low end of this continuum, people's brains will react to lots of things, notice many, many things, and have high reactions because they're noticing so much. Now, when we intersect that with a construct that came from the psychological and social literature, particularly personality and temperament research, it's called self-regulation. It's our ability as humans to manage ourselves in the everyday. So this continuum goes from passive on the left, which means we tend to let things happen to us and then react to them, to active self regulation on the right, where people engage in behaviors to manage their own amount of sensory input. Sometimes they engage in behaviors to get more input, and sometimes they engage in behaviors to get less. So when we intersect these two constructs from neuroscience and social research, we end up with these four patterns of sensory processing. And this is what the families told us. And we've done a lot of subsequent research, and these four patterns show up over and over again. So the first one is called seeking. And as you can see on the diagram, it's high sensory thresholds and active self-regulation. This means that people that have a seeking quality, their brains are geared to detect novelty. They're looking for new and interesting and different forms of sensory input. And because they're geared to detect that novelty, they engage in behaviors to get more. Children and adults do things like play with fidgets, and at school, a child might run their hand along the bricks as they're walking down the hall. People might skip instead of just walk. People might put extra clothing on to have more weight on their body. So seekers like sensation and they want more of it. The second category is called avoiding. Now, avoiders also have active self-regulation, but their brains are geared to detect novelty as potentially harmful or dangerous. So their reactions on the active self-regulation is to do things to get less input or to get predictable input. So avoiders like routines. They like to have things be the same over and over again. And when it's not, they have behaviors that we might see as retreating or having a meltdown. You know, when we talk about emotional regulation, when you have low sensory thresholds, your brain is telling you that something's wrong and you gotta get out of there. So if we see through the behavior to the thing that might be the cause of it, we can see that even though those behaviors are difficult, they're also adaptive in the sense that their brain is trying to help them be safe. Now, the third category is called sensitivity, and that's also low thresholds like avoiders, but they have a more passive self-regulation method. So sensors are more likely to try things. They want to participate, but then they can get overwhelmed. Some of the outward behaviors you might see are being very picky or sometimes getting bossy. And the bossiness isn't just bossiness, it's a strategy to try to get all the sensory input in line, to keep everything in a particular category. I remember when my one of my daughters was a child, the smell of bubble gum on the children's uh, breath gave me a headache. And so she would preemptively tell everyone, don't chew any bubble gum around mom. So those strategies, again, they're adaptive, but they're also still things we need to contend with. And the fourth one is called registration. So registration, we call people that have a registration pattern, we call them bystanders because they have a high threshold, just like seekers, but they don't go after sensory input the way seekers do. They let things happen. So bystanders are they're very easygoing, but they can also miss cues that might be important, like directions from parents or directions from teachers or other things around that they might need to notice. So when we look at these four patterns, we see things that happen in different populations, which I'm going to show you next. So our bottom line here is that everyone has sensory patterns. I'm sure you noticed some things in just hearing those four that sound like you. They show up in everyday life, and they continue across time. We have our same sensory patterns even as adults. And so we have to think about how the sensory patterns we have for ourselves are manifesting in the choices that we're making in our lives. So Francis wrote a book called Saving Normal in 2013. And this is a quote that I love from it to sort of frame our discussion. Human difference was never meant to be reducible to an exhaustive list of diagnoses. It takes all types to make a successful tribe and a full palette of emotions to make a fully lived life. We should not medicalize difference and attempt to treat it away. This is a mantra for me. These differences in sensory patterns that we see in the autistic population are merely differences. We don't know if they're interfering until we look at the child's life, or until we look at the adult's life, or until we look at the family's life. So it's important to remember these are not deficits, they are not dysfunctions, they are merely characteristics. So if we agree that this is possible, I want to show you some data to illustrate what it looks like. All right, so this is a graph I made. We did a study with about 12 or 1,300 children. We took those four sensory patterns I just told you, and we asked ourselves, like, how many of those patterns are in an expected range, which is the all expected, which is the fat part of the bell curve, if you're looking at a bell curve. How many of those four are the reactions less than others, and how many are more than others? So we could have four more than others, we could have four less than others, or any combination in between. So on this graph, the typical or general population is in blue. The autistic population is in green, and the ADHD population is in red. So let's look at this a little more carefully. In the middle, you can see the number of children that had all four scores in the expected range. There are some children from the general population, from the ASD population, and from the ADHD population that got all four of those sensory patterns in the typical range. So this tells us we can't say that having a difference in sensory processing is a dysfunction, because all the children also have typical patterns. So if we look at this, 31% of the ADHD population have all their scores in the expected range, and 18% of the autistic population had all their scores in the expected range. Now let's look at the contrast to the all four of the scores being more than others. So here again, we can see that all the children from all the groups, there were some of them that had all four patterns in the four more than others range. This means that their reactions were bigger than about 98% of the population. So here we are. We have some children. Now, again, we only have about 2% of the general population, but we do have some that have that. And we have 21% of the ADHD population and 36% of the ASD population. So again, there's an intensity difference. In fact, I would argue this intensity has helped us to understand what sensory processing is, because we see a more clear reaction in the autistic population, for example. And then we can see that we also have that pattern. It might not be as intense, but we have some of those same reactions. So instead of it being something different in a dysfunctional way, it's different in a continuum sort of way. All right, the second thing I want you to, oopsie. The second thing I want you to remember is that sensory processing shows up in settings. You have to think about not just the child and their patterns, or the parent and their patterns. You have to also think about the setting. There's an interaction between the person's patterns, the demands of the task, and the features of the setting. There's no universal right answer. We always have to consider the activity in the setting, at school, at home, in the community. For example, being a bystander shows up differently across settings. When we're at a fine dining restaurant with multiple courses coming in and out, a bystander might have enough stimulation to be actively participating, but they might miss something at home because there's not as much to trigger all of their sensory thresholds to fire. So think about these four settings. There are different characteristics that might be good or hard for any particular person. The third is that every activity has sensory features. Look at these three activities. There's vibration and sound and the feeling of the wood hitting you when you're sanding, the emotional connection between the adult and child when they're kicking the ball, the intense cognition in addition to the features of the typing and looking at the screen. All of these have different features too. So I want to break that down for you. There's two ways to consider interactions. The first is on the left, the person in every context. This is the same little girl in four places: home, school, at a scouting meeting, and in the park. But secondly, we also have to consider that one context, and this becomes important for families and for teachers in classrooms, the different kids in that setting are going to react differently to the exact same thing. So that idea that everybody's going to be calm in a particular situation is erroneous. I'm going to give you two examples that illustrate these two things. The first one is Julio. Now, on the left side, we see Julio on the playground. He is not happy. We don't know if he's frustrated or angry, or if he doesn't know how to do it, or if another child has bumped into him and he's mad. We don't know this particular circumstances, but I want you to think about how the playground monitor is going to describe Julio in this circumstance. Contrast that with Julio, the same child, in the Science Center on the right. He has a docent there. They're looking at a case. Perhaps it's one of Julio's special interests, and he's very engaged. So the way the docent would explain Julio would be different than the way that the playground monitor would explain Julio. And this is because sensory patterns aren't just about the person. They're about how those sensory patterns then show up in different places. So your sensory patterns can help you or interfere with your performance depending on what the circumstances are. So this is an example. We all have those in our lives. Now, the other way to think about it is the same situation with two different people. These are two girls that are in a wedding. You can see that one of them is really enjoying all the activities of the wedding, and the other person is like done with it. She's got her hands over her ears, she's frowning, she is very unhappy. So we have to think about the fact that we don't just give everyone the same situation. Like I want I want the wedding planners to give the girl on the left the job of standing by the book to sign for people to sign in. It's quieter. She can greet people without all the intensity of the social situation. So that both of them can be in the wedding and participate, but they can do it on their own terms. I do have to show you where this picture came from because I think it's a riot. This was the royal wedding. They're standing out on that balcony with all those people below. Can you see how that same circumstance is having a different impact? So the emotional regulation of the girl on the right is very different than the emotional regulation of the girl on the left. So when we add all these parts together, we can see one of our favorites is the Venn diagram. We can see sensory patterns. What are the person's patterns? We can see the activity demands. What are the sensory qualities of this activity? If we think about painting, if you do finger painting, it has a very different sensory quality than if we use a brush to paint. What are the characteristics of the place where the participation happens? Is it in a busy place? Is it in a quiet place? Can we dial the light up and down? What are the other characteristics we might think about? Because when we talk about sensory patterns in humans, the only place that we can consider them is in that yellow triangle, where the sensory patterns of the person, the demands that we're putting on that person, and the place we're asking them to participate matters. And it only matters as it works together. So the bottom line here, for all the things we're going to talk about, is that the living is all that matters. The family's life and how they want to live it, the teacher's life and how the teacher wants the classroom to run, and what the teacher wants the children to learn. Our job is not to change sensory processing. We don't measure sensory patterns and then measure changes in sensory patterns. We measure the changes in the life patterns because we have supported the sensory patterns underneath. And this is the underlying factor that helps us with ideas like emotional regulation. One of the ways that you can think about this, if you're a professional, and this might just be your worksheet. I do a lot of like working on things in my head and writing down diagrams before I might write a report or give a report to a family. So you can have the sensory patterns on the left, and you can ask yourself, you write in at the top, what is the activity? What are we doing? And we ask ourselves, with this child, is seeking supporting? Is it not relevant, or is it interfering? Let me give you an easy example. If I'm working with a child that uses a communication system, their oral sensory patterns aren't as important to that as their motor skills and other things. So we have to like pair these things together. There are times when seeking doesn't play into the situation, or when avoiding doesn't play into the situation. So we must sort of like think through those problems together to come up with an idea about which sensory systems and which patterns are helping or hurting the particular activity. So the way that we talk about this then is to listen and observe with curiosity. How do the sensory patterns affect the activity? What about this setting might make it easier or harder for the person? Um, Additionally, caregivers and autistic people are telling us their best truth. It is our job to listen and be curious about how sensory processing might play a role in the stories that they're telling. So, for example, in cases where the parent completed a questionnaire like the sensory profile, and they don't align with our observations as professionals, it's really easy to say, well, that parent's in denial, or they're responding that way because they want to qualify for services. But that is a disrespectful way to think about them trying to tell you their personal truth. What we have to do is honor what the caregivers and autistic people tell us as their experience and use that as our starting point. So we might instead say things like, when I'm with your child, they do this. How does that match with what you see? Or we might also say, wow, you have found a better way to manage mealtime than we have. Tell us what it looks like at mealtime so we can use some of your ideas here at preschool. I had a situation with a preschool program, and the little girl was having a terrible time at snack time, and the mom kept saying, she does fine with eating at home. And the teachers are really mad about it at first because they're like, how can she be doing it okay at home? But when we finally then ask the parent, like, tell me what mealtime looks like, these parents, with their good intuition, had narrowed down all the parameters about the thing called eating so that they could manage to get this child fed. So they turned off the audio, the TV, the radio. They still put her in a high chair because that was a way to sort of manage, and it helped her feel a little bit more safe because her body posture was a little bit more unstable. And they only fed her preferred foods. So you can see that they didn't understand how that mattered, but they had figured out a way for eating to be okay. And so when we hear the story, it looks very different than preschool snack time. But because we were respectful and asked how it looked, we were able to then negotiate. Like mom sent preferred foods for about 2 weeks while we figured out how to do preschool snack time. We put her at the end of the table. We talked about turn taking. She was accessible to learning all those other skills that children need to learn because we were managing some of the parameters that the parents had already learned to manage to support her participation. So, how are sensory patterns, self-regulation, and socialization linked? Considering this conversation so far, I hope you can see that We need to hear from people about their lived experiences to have more insights. Emotional regulation happens in real time. And so we need to feel and hear how it is for people before we think about what to do next. I'm going to use primarily two primary sources. One is from a federally funded program called swiftschools.org. They'd had a big grant and they figured out all these things. Their tagline was all means all. And Dan Habib, who's a videographer, created some of the videos that helped people understand what self-advocates were asking us to do. And then the second thing is we're going to look at a lot of things that self-advocates actually say about how emotional regulation and sensory processing are linked together for them in their lived experiences. So this is the
This
visual.
film features schools in Maryland, Mississippi, and Oregon implementing the school-wide integrated framework for transformation, SWIFT. SWIFT is a national K-8 technical assistance center that builds school capacity to provide academic and behavioral support to improve outcomes for all students through equity-based inclusion.
So that's what Swift is about. And I really encourage all of you to go to swiftschools.org. They have a really lot of good resources. So our second source is analysis that I did with one of my doctoral students about what self-advocates, adults who have lived with autism their whole lives, what they have to say about the connection between emotional regulation and sensory processing. And we found four themes. And this is the first one: the effects of personal sensory preferences on social interaction. So here are some quotes from these autobiographical authors. They discuss addressing personal sensory features as a precursor to any social interaction. In blue, Zojia Sachs says, "My senses seem to work on a quota system. I only have a set amount of energy or capacity to deal with incoming sensory information. I refer to this as my finite number of sensory processing units. If most of my sensory processing units are dealing with one type of input, fewer units are available for processing other types of input." Similarly, John Elder Robison in Pink says, quote, "To this day, when I speak, I find visual input to be distracting. When I was younger, if I saw something interesting, I might begin to watch and stop speaking entirely." It is worth noting that while these two examples describe different aspects of communication, Zach's referring to input and Robison talking about speaking, they both demonstrate the link between socialization, emotional regulation, and the sensory systems. Each of these authors discuss the feeling of stress and anxiety caused by sensory-related challenges as barriers to interacting with others. Now, Barron and Grandin wrote a book together, and I want to give you a couple of quotes from them. They speak about the aversion to interacting with classmates during lunchtime. Quote, "The noise and commotion were taxing to my senses. 30 kids in an enclosed room was one thing, but 10 times as many in a wide open, echoey space or a room that is overwhelming because I felt naked, exposed, and on display, even if no attention was on me." Temple Grandin discussed the impact of sensory-based anxiety on intervention practices, writing that until such issues, quote, "are addressed and alleviated, forget trying to teach more advanced aspects of behavior and sociability," end quote. Collectively, the autobiographical authors report that their sensory systems directly affect their social interactions. In studies, I'm using Crane Goddard and Ping as an example. They have shown that when they test autistic adults, they have the exact same patterns they had as children, and they have the same patterns as other children growing up with autism at the same time. So we also have to get over this idea that we're going to fix the sensory systems. We're going to know them, and in knowing them, we're going to create more friendly places for people. Our second theme is the importance of choosing friends and peers. A key component of each of their friendships in these autobiographies was the level of comfort that existed between the authors and the other person, a result of having shared interests. One author described frustration during attempts to practice learned socialization techniques with people whom he did not share common interests, saying, quote, "My efforts to placate the rest of the campus by pretending to be normal resulted in pleasing virtually nobody while making me just as miserable and angry as I had been for much of my life." Saperstein's statement underscores other authors' beliefs that common interests form the basis for successful friendships. Robeson said, quote, "As a young adult, I was lucky to discover and join the world of musicians and sound men and special effects people. People in these lines of work expected to deal with eccentric people. I was smart, I was capable, and I was creative, and for them, that was good enough." Temple Grandin directly addresses the importance of providing people an opportunity to choose their friends and to cultivate friendships rather than being selected out of convenience, which sometimes we do when we're doing research, for example. She says, true friendships are built on shared interests or shared ideas or shared principles that you both hold meaningful. Just being the same age or the same sex or in the same class or going to the same after school activity does not make a person a friend. Zach's expanded on the benefits of choosing friends with similar interests by highlighting that friends with similar interests are more likely to participate in activities together. This sounds like all the rest of us too, doesn't it? Unlike social skills training, which is abstract and practically only practiced periodically, a friend is there during live action and understands life as it is. You may do eye contact perfectly during social skills sessions where you know what the therapist expects, but while hanging out on the football field, you may not be able to maintain proper eye contact. A friend can prompt you in a natural way by saying, quote, "Don't forget to look at Sally this time when you ask her out for hot chocolate after the game." So let's listen to students that are in a school that has all the children there to hear what they have to say about this social and friendship thing.
Lily belongs.
All right, everyone has a worksheet. Number one, we have all been convinced by others to buy or do things. Who on the list below usually is best at convincing you? Who is second?
Every student has the right to receive instruction with our age-appropriate peers in a general education setting, and it's our job to figure it out. It's not the student's job to figure it out. It's the adult's job to figure it out. And it's hard sometimes. It's all the adults are the ones that get in the way, right? It's not the kids. The kids don't ever get in the way. The kids live up to your expectations. So if you expect them to be peers with each other, they're peers with each other.
How do you think respect plays a role in someone being able to persuade you? Lily, what do you think? Do you think it's easy?
Easy.
So you think you could convince Jackson to give you his last piece of gum? No, but you guys are good friends, aren't you?
Yep.
Yep, that's what I thought. Okay. Stay right here. Lily wants you to. Lily, what do you think you want to do?
I think Lily belongs in our classroom because she is wonderful and she likes to make friends and she's nice to everybody. She respects everybody around her. She respects the teacher. She respects her things. And it shows us, like, she's like a role model for us.
You have a good day. You are a party yet. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we would have had it any other way, right? I mean, it's just socially, she's just another kid in the crowd, which is a really big deal for us, right?
This is my third year teaching, and I think before this year I'm working with Lily and some other students in my class with these severe disabilities, I probably would have said there is a separate place for some students to learn, but I really honestly feel that general education setting is the place for all students to learn. I feel like not only do they benefit from being together with their peers, but I think the peers really benefit from that as well.
Well, I met her first last year in math class. she was at a different table, and I thought, oh, maybe I can meet a new friend because I'm not really that social, but she's just really funny and good to be friends with her.
Hard to explain, but with that problem that we're doing on the board, when she does that and I can help her with that, it helps me understand more about what we're doing.
I try to modify things where it doesn't look any different for her. So I really like using the Chromebooks. If everyone else is, working on an assignment that is short answer or maybe even essay, I can create something for her on the Chromebook that's multiple choice or fill in the blank, or she could speak to the text and it could type it for her. But if you were to come in the classroom and look, it looks the same to everyone. I think it builds her self-confidence. She fits in with everyone, which is awesome.
Our third theme is a recognition that parents and family are the principal influencers on our social development. Saperstein describes this in this way, quote, "After we moved to California, when I was 16, I had settled into a new school. I spent many evenings in our California living room, sometimes till 1 or 2 in the morning with one or both parents. They would spend several hours trying every way they knew to explain the most basic concepts of how relationships work." Stephen Shore echoes this idea. Given enough intense time with a loving and caring person, such as mother, the person with autism can become a master at reading social cues. They also discuss their gratitude to the devotion from their parents. Sean Barron says, over time, and thanks largely to my parents' patience, I started to develop a sense of critical judgment. It took years of listening, absorbing, and watching these things and asking questions to get insight. Most of the authors cite their parents as a primary reason. Zach says family members are those who love us the most, and so they're the most likely to keep helping us along the way. We have to look at the importance of the family as a place where a lot of these emotional regulation skills are started, which is why we have to support the people who are caring for the children we're serving in order for the good outcomes to happen. For example, consistent with the autistic adults' lived experiences, as I've just described, studies also show that sensory processing is different in children. The sensory processing for children, that have sensitivity, for example, they have the same levels of enjoyment when they're with their family or a small number of friends, but their social participation deteriorates when they're in larger groups. And even children in the general population who have sensitivities, low sensory thresholds, have differences in their social participation, which means that both the general population and the autistic population have the exact same experiences when they have low sensory thresholds. This suggests that the patterns that we're looking at are key factors to identify how we can make adaptations to create a satisfying experience for everyone. Our fourth pattern was social skills training. Based on their personal experiences, the authors discussed how they feel about social skills training. Zoja Sachs says that a more direct explanation about the different types of information is important, not just practicing rote things out of context. Zach says, since the very nature of friendship involves social exchanges between two people, understanding concepts of friendship can be like trying to figure out how to act on an alien planet. Think about yourself in a foreign land. You don't know what the rituals are. And this is sort of the experience that the self-advocates told us about. And then Zach goes on to say, we might choose to avoid most forms of social contact and be by ourselves. Having certain information about friendships adds to our ability to choose when to be alone rather than feeling lonely. Barron wrote that understanding different types of relationships was really important. He discussed the differences between relationships with the teachers and relationships with peers in high school, and crossing over the same skill set to the different one was some of the things that he targets as leading to some social isolation that he didn't actually want. Grandin suggests that service providers need to consider the distinct differences between different social skill functions. Like what it's like when you're going to a funeral and what it's like when you're going to a party and what it's like, even though the rest of us kind of know how to do that adaptation, autistic people frequently do not. And when their sensory systems are overloaded, their capacity to learn in that chaotic environment goes down really fast. Saperstein also talks about this idea of functioning and uses this example. Like a Microsoft Word program, I have stored separate files for funerals, weddings, job interviews, first dates. These files may be accessed at a moment's notice, and they compensate for my deficiencies with generalization. So what he's saying is that we have to look at the context and the activities to see when we provide support and how we do so. Not only do we have to, this is something that Stephen Shore said, not only do I have to decode the words on the verbal channel, I also have to deal with the nonverbal channel, consisting of body language, facial expressions, tone of voice. To further confuse things, what's actually being said may be different from what's implied by the vocal inflections. And so I don't know what's going on in the nonverbal channel. Trying to read between the lines is confusing, he said. So they all talk about the complexity of it. This is a comment from a speech pathologist in the Swift Schools program.
When I used to pull kids out, I noticed that I was teaching something in isolation, and the kids that I was pulling out have a hard time generalizing skills anyway. And so when they go back to the classroom, they wouldn't use those skills. This way, I know more about what's going on in the classroom, and so I can help support my kids with what they're actually doing instead of working on something separate.
And this is a comment from an autistic adolescent about the idea of separation to train emotional regulation and social skills.
Segregating autistic students, that's the most dumbest and pathetic excuse that I can ever think of. Because they want to get along with the other classmates. It's just like segregation and apartheid. And if this was ever like an autistic school that would be segregated from just a normal school, I would probably feel very sad.
My family has been in this community for over 100 years, but have graduated from this very school building in 1946. My fear was that he was going to be someone that was going to have to be guided and directed his entire life, and that's not the case. I believe he's going to make a difference in this world. And my hopes and dreams are that he has a happy and productive life.
So we have to think about what life is like for everyone. Here's an example. This man is a seeker in the middle. He's going down the lane. He's having his day. The sensor in the front is distracted, and she sees what's going on. The bystander in the front doesn't even notice he's going by. And the man that is the avoider up in the building has the shutters closed so that he doesn't have to deal with what's going on next. My computer is locking up. Sorry. There. So let's look at, before we end, let's look at how we can control and support people in their activities. Let's look at these two environments. They're both study spaces. One of them probably attracts you and one of them doesn't attract you. So in the right, we see a lot of light, a lot of visual features. There's navigating around piles. This is an environment that a seeker would love because their brains are geared to detect novelty and it would keep them engaged in the environment. On the left is a study space for people with low sensory thresholds. You can see there's even a curtain to try to minimize things even more. There's nothing on the wall. There's only a light down on the work and not ambient light. This is how we control the activities and environments to support people with different sensory patterns. Look at these kitchens. Some of you might be attracted to the one on the left, and some of you might be attracted to the one on the right. I would be a poor performer in the really sleek, clean, everything put away kitchen, because as a seeker, I need the novelty to keep myself on track to cook. Look at these 4 living rooms. Again, families have spaces, and if we understand the needs of each member of the family, we can create nooks and crannies and different spaces so that it supports everyone in the family. Emotional regulation is on top, and these sensory features are running underneath. Think about public places like parks. These are 2 very different kinds of parks. You know, we can talk to families and look at websites before they go so they understand how to navigate. For example, they could look at the map and say, if we go around the outside, we'll have less distraction. So we'll together have more capacity to participate in the more active things when we get there. It's about understanding so we can help create friendly spaces. So as I close, I just want to give one example of a boy named Eric. He's 8 years old. He needs to be successful at school. He's in 3rd grade, and he has started to have fights with kids on the playground. He's having a harder time, and he needs to complete his homework and eat dinner with his family. These are all the things that the team said that they needed for him to do. I'm sorry, my computer is locking up. I can't get it to go forward. I'm so sorry. Basically, I have really good pictures. I'm so mad about this. Eric, he was having trouble at school, so we looked at the classroom. The classroom's very crowded and busy, and he's having a hard time navigating. The sensory profile showed that he needs to move, and he couldn't move very well. So we came up with activities so that he could run errands to the office. He could take milk to the kindergarten when they had their snack time. He had opportunities to move in the natural course of the day instead of giving him a chance to move if he earned it. You know, in sensory processing, we think about the phrase "so that." Eric had a high need to move, and so we created opportunities to move so that he could do his seat work, so that he could participate with his peer group. He would be in small groups, and we would send him to the library, or we would have him go get the materials for the rest of the group. This helped him to be a positive participant while we meet his sensory needs. At home, the parents got a standing desk that could go up and down so that he could change his patterns while he was doing his homework. Again, he didn't have to leave homework to get his sensory needs met. The parents also started putting all the food on a counter in the kitchen so that people would have to get up to get their food instead of having it passed around the table, which gave Eric a chance to get away and to get up and move whenever he needed to. So these are just simple examples of how we organize space and time to create emotional regulation, so we don't wait until the child has a meltdown when they're overwhelmed, their brain is telling them it's too much, before we do something. This way, the self-regulation can become a normal part of their routines for interacting with others. And so with that, I'll stop, and if I can stop sharing, I will. I can't find the way to get that to happen. I'll be happy to answer questions. Sorry, Kristen, it's
No
just
worries.
not
Yeah, it was
participating with me at all.
totally fine. And I bet you we can help with the unshare if we need to. So no worries.
Okay. Good.
So that
Sorry.
was awesome. I learned so much, and it's something that is really, again, on my mind as a clinician and someone who serves families in a clinical setting, just really trying to think about how does sensory input and regulation impact the work that I do. Obviously, as a physician, I'm often in spaces where, teachers are really stressed about various
Yes.
things, parents are really stressed, kids are really stressed, and I really resonated with so many of the comments that you had. And I will also say I was laughing to myself because I'm definitely a sensory seeker, as is evidenced by the background, right? So like I like stuff everywhere because I want to basically be like, oh, that reminds me of this, and and so I tease my husband because he is definitely not a sensory seeker. My vanity in my bathroom is like a total mess, and I say that it's because I like to have a treasure hunt every morning for my various.
Exactly.
Come on, it's a game.
Exactly.
So again, I think really great things for us to think about. We do have some really awesome questions that have come in, so let me grab those real quick, and I will talk through a couple of them. So I think one of the things that I really that resonated with me is this particular question about integration in schools. And so thinking about this notion of kind of integration, meaningful inclusion, meaningful integration. And so this person commented that it's so important for the social development for both peers, those with disabilities
Yes.
and those without disabilities. And so in Missouri, this person comments, and I would agree just with some of my experiences as well, is that there appears to be somewhat of a separate but equal approach in our classrooms where it's, this mindset that true integration is not always as obvious as we would hope. And so, how do we work with schools? The question is, how do we work with schools to recognize what integration truly looks like and how putting a child in separate classrooms hinders both populations? So, what are some ways that we can think about that?
It's interesting, Kristen, when you think about system change, which is what the person's talking about,
Yeah.
it isn't easy and fast and simple, and I would say that's the place where the most fun happens because we can think of challenging ways to address it. One of the ways in my career, I when people are really desperate, like when they really are having a hard time with a particular child or a particular situation, they're more willing to try things. And so um, it's sort of anti-intuitive. We want to do the easy ones, and that isn't how it happens. It happens when there's a child that can't figure out what to do. Teachers are so resourceful, but there are times when they have to manage the whole classroom. So one of the ways that I've done is, for example, with Eric, who needed to move, one of the things that we did was we gave him the job of taking the snacks to the kindergarten. So it was a normal, regular thing. Somebody had to do it, and so giving it to him gave him what he needed, and it was still a normal, regular activity of the school. And what that also did was it showed his peers that he could be capable. He would pass by, the rooms and the other teachers would see. So the sort of idea that Eric could participate goes up when we find ways for him to participate in maybe not the regular ways that classrooms do things, but in a way that shows the whole community that he's capable. Um, we had a child at another school I worked with where he was very disruptive. Eric wasn't as disruptive as annoying to people, and so they came up with this idea that first of all, I went and observed, and he had a desk that wasn't the right size for him. It's a simple thing, but as OTs, we always look at, is the body up aligned? Is everything right? And he was in this chair that he couldn't fit in, and so he couldn't put his feet down to stabilize himself. And just changing that changed things. But then the school came up with this idea that every 2 times a week they would deliver all the school supplies, and so this cart was heavy. It had paper and pens, and he would push it around the whole school and deliver things. And so again, it changes the mindset. You have to think of these funky things that are in service to the student that then help everybody have a different mindset about what's possible instead of just sending them away. The other thing is to look at teachers that are willing. instead of trying to get the hardest teacher to do it first. If a teacher's willing because they want to do something and they don't know what to do. I had a teacher say to me one time, I just want to be a better teacher. I don't want to be an OT. Just tell me some things that will help me be a better teacher. And I hope some of the examples I gave give you that idea.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also think you hit on a really important piece when we are thinking about systems change or change in general. Frankly, often I think it's best to start with the coalition of the willing, right? It's not
Yes.
for everybody. And over time, there might be more people who jump on board, but it's finding the people who are excited and interested and willing, and that really resonated with me. So thank you for that. A couple more questions. So I'll try to get through a few more because there's some excellent questions. So one person asks, how do we determine a person's sensory profile? So, for example, if I'm a physician, I am a physician. As a physician, what do I look at to figure that out? If I'm a teacher, if I'm different, or a parent, even, like, how do I know? How does that? What do I use to look at that?
Well, of course, if you're in a system, using assessments are always helpful because it's against a standard like the sensory profile. But in addition to that, looking at, one of the things I tell teachers is to look at an average child in their classroom and this target child and see what behaviors are different, to
Mhm.
try to get at is it harder during a busy time? Is it harder when they're in transitions? Just because that begins a conversation, it gives you some ideas about what behaviors. I went and observed in a classroom one time, and they told me to just observe the redhead, and there were two. So I took data on both of the children, and
Yeah.
the teacher was bothered by the not target child because that child's behavior was not a good match for that teacher. So one of the things is, when I'm serving, like when you see families or when I'm talking to teachers or families, is I ask them what their experience is so that I hear in their conversation what their sensory patterns are. Like a parent that has low sensory thresholds is bothered by different things than a parent who's a seeker. So asking questions about noise and light and clothing and, like he always wants to wear the same thing every day, that's a clue that there's a tactile feature to the clothing that we need to investigate. Obviously, having an OT involved makes it a lot easier because we study this a little more detailed. But having that idea of hearing the sensory parts of the stories that they're telling, I'm not suggesting that sensory processing is always the answer, but it is an answer that gives us something to do right away. We can turn the lights down. We can change the pants. We can, change the texture of food. We can do some of those things really fast and help parents and teachers feel competent so that they have the fortitude to keep going and trying new ideas.
Yes. Yes, I agreed completely. So I know we're almost at time, but I want to ask one more question. So some folks are asking if they want to learn more, if they want to better understand this your work, this aspect of autism and kind of the experience of autistic people, where can they go? So some people are asking are there support groups, are there trainings, are there different things where they could learn more?
Well, I did do something a few years ago. I wrote a book for the public called Living Sensationally. And the
Mm,
reason I'm bringing it up is it's stories, it's explains the things we talked about this morning, but it tells stories of people's actual experiences at yoga class, at work, on outings. And even though it's not specifically about autism, remember, my belief is that we're all on the continuum together. And
yep.
so by understanding there's a whole chapter on parenting and what strategies, if you're a seeker parent, what you do with a sensor child, um, so that
Awesome.
people can start seeing the world through a sensory lens. It helps them to, the family can then say, Thomas just needs some time alone for a minute instead of Thomas always runs away.
Yep.
It changes the mindset of how people talk. There's also good, now we have Google and we have Google Scholar. I don't know if people know about Google Scholar, if they're family members. There's a lot of really good papers. I can
Mhm.
send some additional bibliography things if you can want to send them
Yeah,
out to your participants
that'd be great.
of things that they can read
That would be
to get a
awesome.
better idea.
Yeah, I think that would be awesome because again, I think so many opportunities here. And I know something clinically that I've been doing more is I've always referred to occupational therapy, typically for adaptive skills and things like that, but specifically now with the intent behind thinking about sensory regulation, thinking about emotion regulation, and not necessarily in the context of sensory processing disorder, but in
No,
thinking,
no,
right,
no, no,
agreed.
no.
I know.
They're
Agreed.
not disordered. They're
I
just
totally agree. Yep, I totally agree. And I'm literally giggling because when I think about this, I have so many different ways that I experience the world around me, depending on the context. Like if I'm amped up, like my most recent example is going to the gym. Holy moly. I don't go to
yeah,
the gym and I don't like it. And so my first foray back into it was really, really overwhelming for me,
yes.
like crazy overwhelming. And I thought a lot about my autistic friends and patients and whatever. And I was like, wow, well, first of all, I started to wonder about me, but that's okay. And I think that when we think about this continuum, right? And I know some
Right.
people have asked questions about situationally based sensory, but yes, right?
It's all situation based.
Yep, yep,
And
agreed
the thing
completely.
that you're making me think of is, when we understand it, the other thing that happens is teachers and family members can start using language. They can I had a mom that had really low sensory threshold. She had a son that was a seeker for movement. Well, it would drive her insane trying to make dinner, for example. So she'd say, um, Sam, I know that you need to move right now. Um, it's hard for me because it's too much for me, but you can
Mhm.
go out in the yard and play, or you can go in the basement, like the trampoline's outside and whatever is down in the basement. Like it gives a neutral way for families and
Yes.
teachers. The teacher can say, Sam, I know that humming helps you, but it's distracting for your peers. Would you like to go in onto the back of the room to work? Or
Mhm.
if I send you to the library, would that help? Like it
Yeah.
creates a neutral zone where we can name it and then have a strategy that goes with it without you're a bad student, so I'm sending you
Exactly.
away. It changes
Yep.
the whole narrative where we
Totally.
all talk about, like you just did. You talked about your sensory patterns and how it
Yeah.
affected an event. Like it's okay. That's how humanity works.
Yep, I agree. Well, Winnie, I could talk to you for a long time about this because I know that we share a lot of common interests, and
Yes,
I
we
thank you
do.
so much for your time this morning. I know that our participants have been really encouraged by your comments and by your sharing of your expertise. So thank you so much.